Welcome to the show, Ailia.
Delighted to be here.
Now, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm a writer, and I grew up in a household where both of my parents were in the hair care business. My mother was vice president of the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company, and my father, who worked for the Walker Company for a brief time after they were married, became president of Summit Laboratories, which was one of the newer black hair care companies in the late 1950s. So I grew up surrounded by the hair care business, but my personal passion was writing. So I worked on the school newspapers and became a journalist and had a 30-year career as a producer and an executive with NBC News and ABC News, and began to write books about Madam Walker. And all along the way I was doing research, and now I'm working on my fourth book about the Walker women.
What sparked you to go into your family history and write about them?
I grew up knowing a little bit about it, but it's not like we sat around the dinner table every night and talked about Madam C.J. Walker. But my mother was going to work there every day. The silverware that we used had Madam C.J. Walker's monogram on it. The china that we took out for special occasions had belonged to Madam Walker. The baby grand piano that I learned to read music on had been Ailia Walker's and was played by some of the famous people during the Harlem Renaissance. So there were things in my house that related to them, but my mother was wise enough not to make it a big deal. It was just that was part of life. And I began to do a little bit of research about Ailia Walker when I was in high school. I was very interested in the Harlem Renaissance. And we had some books that had belonged to people like Langston Hughes and Countee Cullen. And I would read those books. And I was more excited about her life than I was about her mother's life, than about Madam C.J. Walker. But I knew something about the story, but not all of the details that I certainly know now. But the real key for me was when I was in graduate school in journalism at Columbia University in New York. My advisor was a woman named Phyllis Garland. She was the only black woman on the faculty. She had written for Ebony and Jet. Her mother had been an editor at the Pittsburgh Courier, a very famous black newspaper. And Phil saw that my name was Ailia, and as we discussed what I would write about for my master's paper, Phil said, well, that your name is Ailia. Do you have any connection to Madam C.J. Walker and Ailia Walker? And I was not walking around with a sign on my head saying I'm related to Madam Walker. I wanted to be my own person doing my own thing. But Phil, I am so grateful to her because she encouraged me to write about it. She said, that's what you're going to write your paper about, because there had not been a major biography written about her, about those two women. So that's how I came to become the family biographer.
I really appreciate you writing it. Actually, my husband told me about the book because he knows how much I love Madam C.J. Walker. He told me about the book, and it was crazy because we went into a bookstore, and I was like, oh, my God, the book is right there. So I had to pick it up and buy it.
Wow. And where was this?
This was in Chicago, and I don't remember the name of the bookstore. But we were in Chicago, in Hyde Park. We went into the bookstore, and there it was, and I had to buy it. And it is an excellent, excellent read, and I actually recommend it to so many people. And when I contacted you, because I wanted you to be on the show, I had just finished talking about your book on social media, and I said, you know what, let me pick up this phone and give her a call. So I'm really happy that you are here. But I really want to go into the history of Madam Walker because you gave so much insight into her life. And many of us went to school and learned that she became wealthy from inventing the straightening comb and making black hair look more Caucasian, but that's not true. So why do you think there are so many myths about how she amassed her wealth?
I think that with I think history is really poorly taught in most of our schools. And I think that we fill in the blanks as African Americans to try to create our own narrative that either makes us feel good or sort of answers some questions. And so a lot of times we just don't have the facts. And it's why it's, in the last 2 decades, some really fabulous biographies have been written about people who needed to have biographies. Without that sort of deep scholarly research, there's a vacuum that gets filled. And I think through the years with Madam Walker's story, we've always been extremely concerned about our hair, about our looks, about our color. I mean, these things are really still very essential to how we deal with our identity and how we treat other people. And I think with Madam Walker, when she started, her problem was that she was going bald. Most Americans didn't have indoor plumbing. Most African Americans at the time she started her company lived in the rural South. People weren't urban. And so they were losing their hair to scalp disease, really because of hygiene. And we don't really want to talk about that. That's sort of like, people, weren't washing their hair. And so we've been filling the blanks with other things. Madam Walker's real problem that she was solving was this losing her hair, was having bad dandruff. She developed a shampoo, and then she developed an ointment with sulfur that healed the scalp disease, and then her hair could grow back. She did use the hot comb. She did not invent the hot comb. It was around a long time before her. But she thought that was an improvement over what were called pullers, which were, they're like flat irons. And she thought the flat irons made the hair too flat and lifeless, and she thought the comb was an improvement and it separated the strands. Now, just like you see people with weaves, and you see people who have weaves that are well done, and you see people who have weaves that are over the top, she couldn't control when people wanted to straighten their hair, like, as they said, the cat licked it. Her idea was that we would, have clean scalps, healthy hair. Her goal was not to straighten hair. Her goal was to have healthy hair. But the styles, obviously, because of the pressure of these European standards of beauty, she was not immune to it, as Black women of the era were not immune to it, just as they are not immune to it now. But it really was not her goal to make Black women look white. She did not like that idea.
And she actually went out into the public and said that she did not like that idea, right? Because there were a lot of newspapers writing articles about her actually making hair care products that made Black women's hair look more Caucasian.
Right. There were, you would see these ads in newspapers, and Black newspapers around in the 1890s and early 1900s, and they were white-owned companies, and they would do before and after pictures. And they were just pen and ink drawings. And the before picture was a woman with darker skin and blotches on her skin, and her hair was kind of sticking up all kinds of ways. And the after picture looked like a white woman. And that was what they were selling. You can look this way. But Madam Walker put her own image on her products, her own photograph. And her first advertisements, her hair was quite full and quite bushy and quite long. And she did a before and after, but the before picture was when she was almost bald, and the after picture was showing that her hair had grown down to her shoulders, but it was more natural. It wasn't really, slicked down in that sort of Gibson girl look, which was very popular around that time.
When we talk about old money, we generally mention the Marriotts, the Hiltons, the Rockefellers, but there are a lot of Black people back then who were really making money in addition to Madam C.J. Walker. But when you think about the money that was passed down through generations, through the Hiltons and Marriotts and the other people, it doesn't necessarily match the heirs that came from Black people who were making all of that money back then. What do you think happened?
Well, sort of the old money, Vanderbilts, Carnegies, Astors, those are some of the original billionaires, Carnegies, Rockefellers in America. And some of those families were able to hold on to their wealth. But as you go down through the generations, that money either is invested differently. Some people owned a lot of property. So a lot of, some families who had a lot of money 200 years ago still have a lot of money, and some people don't. One of the key variables for people like Madam Walker who made their money in the teens, the early part of this century, is that the Depression really wiped out a lot of fortunes, and it wiped out a lot of Black fortunes to the degree that there were any, and it wiped out a lot of white fortunes. So in the case of the Walker Company, when Madam Walker died in 1919, the annual sales were, sort of about $250,000, a little more than that, which would be $4 or $5 million today, but then really a lot of money. And then through the 20s, the company did well, and then the Depression hit. So sales that were $250,000 in 1919 and 1920 had gone down to $30,000 during the midst of the Depression. The company had just built a new building in Indianapolis, $1 million building, and they were still paying for that building when the Depression hit. The building was finished in 1927. So it is a miracle that the company stayed in business and didn't go out of business. And actually, it still exists. It's about to launch a new line. So the next time we talk, I'll have more information about that. But yeah, the wealth really sort of was cut off because the Depression, customers couldn't afford the products. Black people weren't making, people couldn't afford to spend 50 cents or $1 on hair care products. And so the sales just dwindled during that period of time.
You just mentioned something that I'm very interested in. I know you can't say much about it, but you said that you're launching another line. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us if the Walker family, including yourself, is going to manage the line? Will you own the line? How is it?
I'm involved in the line. The company was sold in the mid 80s, and it was sold by the board of trustees. It had really sort of dwindled, and it was pretty moribund for quite a long time. But there are new owners at Sundial Brands, and they are fabulous. They own Shea Moisture and Nubian Heritage. These guys are really quite good at what they do, so I'm looking forward to being a part of what they're doing.
When we talk about entrepreneurs today, how can we ensure that the wealth is passed down throughout generations?
This is very important, and a lot of us are, we see families who are first generation wealth, people who've made a lot of money. This generation now, we're sort of 3 full generations into affirmative action, into post civil rights era, where universities opened up, where corporations, law firms, hospitals, etc. opened up. So now we have 2 and 3 generations of people who have been solidly middle class, solidly upper class, and a few really wealthy people for over the last 40 years or so. Now, what can happen with that first generation wealth is that the next generation often doesn't have to go through the same struggles, and the generation that makes the money sometimes doesn't want their children to go through the same struggles, and so they don't learn how to manage their money. They spoil them. They buy them BMWs when they're 16, when they probably should buy them a used Camaro or Camry. So it is teaching literacy to that next generation, and I have been able to be a part of some conversations. I have a very good friend who teaches financial literacy to very wealthy families. Most of them are white, not all of them are white. And to make sure that the next generation knows how to work, gets a summer job, isn't spoiled, knows how to manage money, understands that, just giving money to kids is not a good idea, that they need to have some self-worth. They need to figure out that they need to make a contribution and not just have things given to them. Those are really difficult lessons to teach. But there are, the banks and the trust companies that are helping wealthy people, regardless of race, manage their money, are very interested in making sure that the children of those people understand what wealth is about and how to protect it and how to use it and invest it, how to be good stewards and philanthropists.
I talk about direct sales a lot on the show. Why did Madam C.J. Walker choose direct sales as her means for getting her products to the marketplace?
It really was, when you think about an era before the internet, before email, before Skype, before airplanes, before really most people didn't have telephones, before television, before radio. How are you going to get your product to the market? And her way of getting the product to the market was to first go door to door and sell her products. And then she created schools where she trained women, and she would ship the products to the women who were her hairdressers and who were her salespeople. That was really, she could get directly to the women. She couldn't go through an internet, some distribution network. She couldn't use the white newspapers. There was no other way other really than to empower individual women to sell the products. The drugstores, there wasn't a CVS chain of drugstores where she could sell her products. And then her agents really wanted to be able to sell the products themselves because they could buy them, as people do with many of the direct sales companies now, buy the products at 50% off and then sell them at 100% and make the profit. When she proposed putting a couple of products in drugstores around the country, her agents were not happy with that. They wanted to be able to continue to do direct sales because they could make the profit.
Now, what were some methods, because you mentioned her agents a couple of times, what were some methods that she used to get so many agents?
She was on the road all the time. She used, her company eventually was based in Indianapolis. She started in St. Louis and she moved to Denver. She lived there briefly. There weren't a lot of black customers in Colorado. By this time she had married Charles Joseph Walker, and then they began to travel throughout the southern United States and the eastern United States where there were more black customers. And then she settled briefly in Pittsburgh, and then she moved to Indianapolis in 1910. And Indianapolis was near the center of population of the country. But at that point, California was really not very well populated. There were trains that ran through Indianapolis every day, and she had a mail order business, so the way that she transported and shipped her products was primarily by train. There were black Pullman porters who came on those trains, and of course they were traveling all over the United States. So they would pick up the newspaper, the black newspaper in Indianapolis that carried her advertisements. They'd sell those newspapers. People could see her mail order address, and they could then, sorry about that.
No problem.
Since we're recording this, let me just tell this person I'll call them right back.
Okay, no problem.
Hi, Lance. I'm doing an interview, so I'll call you back. All right, bye-bye. Sorry about that. Okay.
No problem.
So the Pullman porters would sell the newspapers that had Madam Walker's ads in them. People would read about that, whether they were in Boston or San Francisco or Chicago or Atlanta. They could then order the products. Then she traveled around the country. She was on the road most of the year, going from city to city, even going to the Caribbean and Central America, training sales agents. Women could take her course by mail order. And then they were empowered and trained to be Walker agents. And so that was how she began to get her products out there. But she had to train people how to do her Walker system, how to wash the hair, how to apply the ointment, how to care for it over time as the hair was growing back.
Again, I talk about direct sales all the time. She's doing all of that in the early 1900s. There are no excuses these days at all.
Right. Well, that's true. It's true. In 1917, 2 years before Mary Kay was born, she had her first convention of her sales agents in Philadelphia. 200 black women came from all over the country to learn about the products, to be empowered, to be inspired, to get some motivation. And these women who had been sharecroppers and maids and washerwomen, and now they're making their money independently. So that was the power of direct sales. They were making their own money, traveling, buying homes, educating their children, contributing to charity. And like Mary Kay, she gave prizes to the women who sold the most products, but she also gave prizes to the women who had contributed the most to charity in their communities. So she wanted these women to feel powerful. She wanted them to be leaders in their community. But direct sales was just very important to what she was doing.
And this is why my husband knows that I love Madam C.J. Walker so much, because I own a business, and I'm telling you, when I'm going through some hard times, I always tell myself, look, if Madam C.J. Walker could do this in the early 1900s, I can definitely do this in 2015. There are no excuses at all.
Yeah, well, because when you wake up in the morning, if you are motivated, and sometimes we have to do things to motivate us, but, all you have to do is go on to the internet and listen to a TED Talk.
Right, exactly.
Right. Or, or go on to your Facebook page and send out a question to friends, or read, there's no excuse. Yes, sometimes people are like depressed. Okay, I get that. But you can get yourself up out of that, and you can see what other people have done. You can go watch a seminar online. You can go to a networking meeting. You can go to the Small Business Administration. There are just so many things that can connect us now that she didn't have.
Exactly. Black hair care is estimated to be a 500. I was getting ready to say 300, but it's a $500 billion industry. And for the most part, Black people do not own it.
True.
What principles of Madam C.J. Walker's entrepreneurial spirit can be used today to correct that?
I think it is investing back in your business. But, the same kind of... Madam Walker was able to fill a vacuum. So when you think 110 years ago, essentially, when she started, there was no real cosmetic industry. Madam Walker, her major competitor, Annie Malone, Helena Rubinstein, Elizabeth Arden, these were 4 key Black women to creating what is the modern hair care and cosmetics industry. Men weren't paying any attention to this industry. Makeup was something that only women on the stage and women on the corner wore. The hair care remedies that people made, these were sort of humble recipes that people made at home, or that maybe the corner pharmacist made, and it was not considered a scalable business. And these women developed that business. Well, of course, once they began to develop the business, and men saw how profitable it was, and people who had deeper pockets saw how profitable it was, they wanted to push their way in. Madam Walker was approached by a number of white companies who wanted to buy her business, and she would not sell it to them. But then over time, people have, businesses get sold. People develop businesses so that they can sell them, so that they can do the next thing. And I think what ended up happening with some of the Black-owned companies is that Revlon and L'Oreal and Alberto Culver saw how much money was being made, and they began to hire the people who worked for those companies. They figured out the formulas. Anybody can, a chemist can figure out the formulas. And they saw how big the market was, and they entered the market, and they controlled the distribution. They controlled the shelf space. So, I remember as a kid, with my dad, who was president of Summit Laboratories, every time we'd go to a drugstore, he would go look on the shelf to see how many inches on the shelf Summit Laboratories products had. And that compared to what Revlon had and what Alberto Culver had. Alberto Culver would say, you have to give us, 150 inches on the shelf, and then that leaves 8 for the smaller companies. And so that was when you began to see the companies being pushed out. And then in many of the Black neighborhoods, there were some of the beauty supply companies. I remember go on vacations, and on summer vacations, our vacations were centered around wherever the hair show was. And we would go to different cities. It was Atlanta or Kansas City or LA or New York or Chicago. And we would go visit the families who owned the Black beauty supplies. Those were middle-class families who had good businesses. Well, then when the riots came through and really destroyed many of the neighborhoods, though many of their stores were destroyed. Well, the parents, many of them who owned the stores, wanted their kids not to have to go through what they went through, so they wanted them to go to medical school and law school. And so those kids began to become professionals, and that was the next generation. I don't mean to make it that simplistic, but I'm just telling you some of the factors that began to change it. It was the big white companies coming in and pushing many of the Black companies out, buying them up. taking the market share and saying, we control this. If you want us on your shelves, then you can only give them that much. The riots, which destroyed some of the neighborhoods where the Black-owned beauty supplies had been popular, and that next generation of children becoming professionals. So there were a whole lot of factors that went into it. And so, but now I think it's very interesting that there are a number of Black-owned companies, once again, primarily women, centered around natural hair care, because people want the narrative that those companies are owned by other Black women. You know, when people found out Dr. Miracle was not a Black woman, they got less interested in that. But the other thing that is key, and I just think we have to, figure out how to keep these companies and make them scalable, make them profitable. But it is a very, very competitive. Shoot, sorry.
No problem.
And this is probably. I just don't know how to turn my ringer down.
That's okay.
Anyway, I'm sure that's a telemarketer. I know who the other person is. It'll go off in a second. Okay, sorry. Anyway, what was I talking about?
You were saying that Black women now they're owning their own businesses.
So now a lot of these companies are owned by Black women. We have to figure out ways to scale these companies up, but it is extremely competitive. So it's not just, I've had people will call me and say, well, I have this product and it really works on natural hair and I want to start a business. Well, you've got to really be able to do the research and development. You have to be able to figure out how you manufacture it. And, we don't like the fact that, for instance, a lot of people complain because Carol's daughter sold her products. It's very hard to scale it up to be competitive. And the way business works is if you've got to have a, $10 million business, a $1 million business can't really compete. So it's, and we have to buy the products. And one of the things that I also note, people say, oh, I want that company to be Black owned. But let me tell you some reality about that. When Madam C.J. Walker, Annie Malone owned Poro, Sarah Spencer Washington owned the Apex Company. Those were the big three Black-owned hair care companies from the 1920s to the 1950s, who were basically doing the same kinds of products. But you know what? Their market share, as much as people wanted to say, I use those products, their market share was really very small. More African Americans were using Vaseline, Dixie Peach, and Royal Crown because they could buy those products for 25 cents a can. And because those companies could scale up and they could, by volume, they could make their products more cheaply. And the Black-owned companies were the prestige labels, but they were more expensive because they didn't have the deep pockets. So people say they want to do something, but you have to really look at what they do. People complain that Miss Jessie's cost this much, and then they can go buy something else for $3 instead of $9. So, we have to look at what the reality is.
You have given us a wealth of information, and I hope everyone out there who is an entrepreneur or who is in direct sales, I hope you are inspired by this episode. Miss Ailia Bundles, how can people get in contact with you?
So I have two websites. My personal website, where I have a lot of blogs and blog articles and videos about Madam Walker, is www.AiliaBundles.com, AiliaBundles.com. And my Madam Walker site is madamcjwalker.com, madamcjwalker.com, no E in Madam. So I would love to hear from folks. And and if I could leave people with some inspirational words from Madam Walker, she said that people often ask her the secret to her success. And she would say to them, there is no royal flower-strewn path to success. And if there is, I have not found it. For whatever success I have attained has been the result of much hard work and many sleepless nights. I got my start by giving myself a start. So don't sit down and wait for the opportunities to come. You have to get up and make them for yourself.
Yes.
So I hope that helps people sell products.
Yes. Thank you so very much for being on Glamour and Brains.
My pleasure.